when we think about sixes, those loyalists on the Enneagram, the idea of warmth isn't usually the first thing that comes to mind.
Right.
But your research, especially looking at the work of Antonio Fernandez Guerrero, dives into this really fascinating aspect
Yeah.
of the six conservation subtype.
Yeah, and I think what is so fascinating about this subtype is how this desire for warmth, this need for belonging and security, it's not passive.
Okay.
It's not just seeking comfort, right?
Mhm.
It's about actively minimizing potential threats. It's like preemptive peacemaking,
It's not just like they're craving a haven, they're actually building it,
Exactly.
like brick by brick, and then inviting others in.
And inviting others in, exactly.
Yeah.
And remember that whole teddy bear analogy, right?
Right.
It's like, it's about offering that same warmth and support they crave.
Yeah.
It's disarming any potential threats by fostering this kind of shared sense of safety.
So instead of meeting anxiety with, say, skepticism and planning like a six social might, the six conservation, they lead with warmth.
Yes.
It's their strategy for navigating the world.
Exactly. And Guerrero, in his analysis of the film Shine, he uses the character of David Helfgott
Right.
to really illustrate this beautifully.
Oh.
And remember, he's analyzing the character,
The character, right, not the actual, yeah.
not the actual pianist, right?
Yeah.
Right. So through David, we really see how this need for warmth and acceptance plays out.
Okay.
Especially in his relationship with his father, who's, quite domineering.
Right. So how does that manifest, I guess, in their lives, this warmth,
Right.
especially when it comes to authority figures?
Well, we see that desire for warmth and acceptance, especially strong with family,
Right.
with a father figure.
Yeah.
That dynamic is so central to the six conservation's motivations.
Yeah. I see that connection there, that real yearning for that sense of belonging and needing to feel supported, especially in family.
Yes. And it can be tricky, because if that security is threatened, if those bonds are compromised,
Hmm.
that's when things get really interesting.
Okay.
And that's where Guerrero's idea of their potential for rebellion comes in.
That's the part that really surprised me. Like, we're talking about a type that desires harmony,
Right.
that sort of freezes in the face of conflict, and yet.
Right. And it makes sense when you think about the root of that rebellion, right? It's not about rocking the boat just to rock the boat.
Right?
It's about protecting that haven,
I see.
defending their loved ones,
Okay.
preserving that sense of warmth and security that they've worked so hard to create.
So it's less like being a rebel with a cause. It's more like a protector of their own carefully cultivated world.
Exactly. It's fascinating how this deep need for security, which might look like timidity at first, it can become courage when those core values are threatened. It's like their loyalty becomes a superpower.
And that loyalty, as I think we'll get into, isn't just limited to like their inner circle.
Right.
It's how they communicate.
Right.
It's their relationship with authority. It's even their capacity for tolerance and open-mindedness, all of which I want to unpack further.
Yes.
But first, a quick break.
It's so interesting how much this idea of loyalty really shapes the world of the sixth conservation.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about how it fuels their need for security, right?
Right.
And even that potential for rebellion when they feel threatened.
Yeah.
But how does that loyalty actually show up in their everyday lives,
Well, I think their communication style is really telling.
Okay.
Because unlike, let's say, the sixth social, who might be more assertive, and needing certainty.
The sixth conservation, they seek reassurance, they look for validation in the way they communicate.
Oh, that's true. Like Guerrero pointed out those phrases,
Yeah.
What do you think? Or I'm not sure. What would you do?
Exactly.
It's like they're almost asking for permission or wanting someone to co-sign their decisions.
Yes. Solidifying those alliances.
Right.
By getting that constant feedback.
And so that creates this really interesting paradox because, like, they're driven by fear, right? They have a lot of doubt.
Right.
But then that questioning actually leads to them being more tolerant of ambiguity.
Yes.
Which seems so counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Like, how can a type that needs to feel so secure also be okay with uncertainty?
It's like by leaning into that doubt, right?
Okay.
By questioning everything, actually, they become more flexible. They're not afraid of the gray areas. They practically live in them.
It's like what Guerrero was saying about their speech patterns, how they don't really speak in in absolutes as much.
Right.
They're more comfortable with nuance.
Exactly.
They embrace the both hand instead of getting stuck in either.
Yes, precisely. And this ties back into their relationship with authority too, right?
Okay.
They might submit to an authority figure if it reinforces their sense of security.
Right, right.
But if that authority figure becomes the threat,
Then it's a whole different story.
exactly, and suddenly that timid teddy bear can become a force to be reckoned with.
Right.
Which brings us to those other examples Guerrero mentioned,
Okay.
like Gandhi or Shakespeare.
Gandhi and Shakespeare. It's hard to imagine them in sixes at first.
I know, right?
They're huge figures. They've
Yeah.
really changed things.
Exactly. And yet, when we look a little bit closer, we can see those six conservation traits, kind of woven into their lives.
Okay, yeah.
Gandhi, with his commitment to nonviolence, his ability to unite people around these shared values.
Right, yeah.
And Shakespeare, his understanding of human nature, the complexities of loyalty and betrayal and fear and love.
Yeah, that's true. It's like they took that very deep need for security and belonging and
Yeah.
made it into something much bigger.
Yes.
But they were just building a haven for themselves. They were building it for everyone.
Exactly. They redefined what it means to be a loyalist. It's not about blind obedience
Right.
or shrinking away from conflict.
Right, right.
It's about aligning yourself with something bigger than yourself, something meaningful,
Okay.
and having the courage to fight for that, even when it's hard.
Right, even when it's uncomfortable.
Exactly.
Which, when you really think about it, that's really at the heart of this paradox we keep seeing.
Yeah.
A type that is driven by fear but can also be so incredibly brave.
Right. And that's why, Guerrero's point that they're the most six of all the sixes.
Oh yeah, I wanted to circle back to that because on the one hand, they're more comfortable with ambiguity, right? They're open to nuance, but they're also considered, the most phobic.
Yeah.
So how do we make sense of that?
Well, I think it's about recognizing that their fear, their doubt,
Right.
it's not a weakness.
Okay.
It's part of who they are. It's how they see the world. But they don't let it paralyze them. They've learned to work with it.
So it's like their fear becomes a strength.
Yeah.
It makes them question more, analyze, prepare.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important piece of the six conservation puzzle, projection.
Oh, okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, we've talked about how aware they are of threats.
Right.
But sometimes those threats are all in their head,
Okay.
They might project their fears and insecurities onto others, expecting the worst, seeing conflict where there isn't any.
So all that overthinking, overanalyzing,
Exactly.
can really lead them down a rabbit hole.
It really can. It's like they're playing this constant game of emotional chess, always trying to be a few steps ahead.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
It can be, and it can lead to a lot of misunderstandings,
Yeah. But I wonder if that tendency to project, if that also comes from a place of empathy. Because they are trying to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, right?
That is an interesting point.
Like to feel the world through their anxieties and insecurities.
Yeah, that speaks to the complexity of this subtype, because even though their fear can cause problems, it also fuels their compassion. They're very sensitive to what's going on beneath the surface emotionally.
It's like they're balancing on this tightrope between their own anxieties and their empathy for others.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's really what their journey of growth is all about. It's
Okay.
about learning to acknowledge their fears without being controlled by them,
Yeah.
and showing grace both to themselves and to other people.
Right. It's about learning to trust their gut, embracing their worth, realizing that those teddy bear qualities, that warmth, the loyalty, the empathy.
Those aren't weaknesses. Those are their strengths.
Beautifully said. And those strengths, as we'll see, they become even more powerful when we consider how the sixth conservation connects with other types.
It's been really interesting exploring all the kind of contradictions and hidden depths of the sixth conservation.
Yeah.
And now it feels like with these arrows, we're following these invisible threads that connect them to the other types.
Yeah, I mean, it's really these connections that make the Enneagram so, rich and complex.
Right.
You remember how Guerrero talked about those arrows in Shine with
Where?
with the character, the connection to 9 and to 3?
Yes. Yes, I'm really curious to unpack those. Let's start with 9, the peacemaker.
Okay.
Because I mean, on the surface, it seems like a natural fit.
Right.
You know, 9s are calmer, steadier. That must be really soothing for a 6 who can be so anxious.
It's more than soothing, though. It's like tapping into this shared energy.
That lets the 6 kind of access a sense of peace and presence they wouldn't have otherwise.
Mm.
Remember how Guerrero talked about David's dedication to the piano?
Right, like it was a way to escape all of that.
Exactly. That focus, the ability to get lost in the music.
Yeah.
That's tapping into that 9 energy.
It's interesting because it's not just about, finding a break from the storm. It's more like transcending it.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And then there's the less obvious connection, the arrow to type 3, the achiever.
That one still throws me a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we've been talking about, 6s wanting to blend in, not stand out.
Right.
And 3s are so ambitious, they want to be recognized.
Right. And it all comes down to motivation.
Okay.
So a 3, might be driven by needing validation from the outside.
Okay.
But for a 6 conservation achievement, it's often more about getting to a goal. Remember how Guerrero talked about how David wanting to be a great pianist? It was tied to his dad's approval.
Right. It all comes back to that, yeah.
It's about proving themselves.
Securing those bonds.
Exactly. It's not about, awards or attention.
Right.
It's about using their skills to feel safe, to feel like they belong.
Okay.
And when their dedication is noticed, it validates them. It builds their self-worth.
It's almost like that drive to achieve is another way they show their loyalty.
Yes.
A way to, like, contribute and strengthen those bonds.
Exactly. And that brings us full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
From wanting warmth and security to maybe being rebellious to being surprisingly okay with not knowing.
Right.
And finally, to turning anxieties into something really powerful.
Yeah, it's about realizing that 6s, even though they feel fear, they can make a real difference.
Yes. In their own lives and in the world.
That's a really good point.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway. Understanding the Enneagram isn't about putting people in boxes.
Right.
It's about seeing what's underneath.
Right.
Accepting that we're complicated and realizing the potential we all have.
So as we wrap up, I think it would be really interesting for our listeners to think about where they see the 6 conservation in their own lives.
Yeah.
And how understanding this type, their journey can help us all be a little more compassionate, a little braver,
Yeah.
and maybe even a little rebellious.